Good day, children. My name is Ned Schneebly. I'd like to take a few minutes to walk you through what will become an exemplary set of notes for Phase 4. Looking at the rubric your teachers will use to assess each set of notes, it indicates that the notes must directly answer the question in detail. Unfortunately, in detail is pretty vague. The length of your notes truly depends on the question for which you are attempting to find the answer. For each set of notes, regardless of the question, there is no minimum number of words or sentences you must have. Conversely, there is no maximum number of words or sentences you may have. Now, that being said, let's take a look at how I, Ned Schneebly, would take a set of notes. One word of caution: this will test your head, and your mind, and your brain too. Well, that's actually 12 words, but away we go. For some context, I've indicated, near the top of this document, what my topic is, and what the issue is. Since you're in 6th grade and you can read, take a minute to look over the detailed descriptions for my chosen topic and issue, before I begin. Got it? Good. Notice for this set of notes, I've already identified the question I'm hoping to answer. How have domestic counter-terrorism strategies changed in the past 20 years? After plugging in variations of that question into Google searches, I found an article published in a New York Times magazine in November of 2018. After running a thorough crap test, I've concluded that this article is reliable. It is, in fact, not crap. Plugging the URL into Isabib, and adding just a bit more information within Isabib, I was able to create the citation seen here. In the revolutionary words of Iggy Azalea, I'm so fancy. Moving on. When I discovered this article, I noticed two things. First, I quickly recognized that underneath its title it says, "For 2 decades, domestic counter-terrorism strategy has ignored the rising danger of far-right extremism." Since my question is focusing on the changes in counter-terrorism strategies in the past 20 years, this article may be just what I am looking for. Second, after scrolling down through the entire article, I noticed that this write-up is formidably long. That's just a fancy way of saying, there is no way in Hades that I am going to read this entire thing. Although the text is mind-numbingly long, what is written below the title makes me think that this source is worth spending a significant amount of time working through, in hopes to answer this crucial question. Knowing that I won't be reading the entire article, I need to decide what I will be reading. I've discovered, over the years, that, when reading non-fiction, if I read the first sentence of each paragraph, I may be able to quickly find the paragraphs with the information that I'm looking for. I'm going to try that. The first indication to Lieutenant Dan Stout that law enforcement's handling of white supremacy was broken came in September 2017. Hold on. I have a pretty good sense that this article is first going to tell me about something that happened that shows how law enforcement, as the title says, failed to see the threat of white nationalism. This may be an interesting story, but, for the sake of time, I'm going to keep moving through the article. Before that August, Stout, a 24-year veteran of the Gainesville police force, had never heard of Richard Spencer. Although that's more of the story from the opening paragraph, I can conclude that, if this officer has been on the police force for 24 years, he's someone who can best show how domestic counter-terrorism strategies have changed in the past 20 years. That certainly strengthens the authenticity of this article. Also, I recognized that I'm not certain what alt-right movement means, or what anti-fascist means. They seem pretty crucial for me to understand, if I'm going to get the most out of this article. So, I've got 2 new questions. What is the alt-right movement and what does anti-fascist mean? Since the answers to the 2 questions will help me better understand this article, I'm actually going to research the answers to those 2 questions before continuing to read this. Okay, after some time researching, reading, and taking notes about the alt-right movement and anti-fascism, I have a better understanding as to what those are. So, back to the article. There were no current intelligence reports he could find on the alt-right. What was the farmer's dog's name? Bingo. This paragraph, I definitely need to read. From the first sentence, I'm getting the impression that it's going to tell me how law enforcement wasn't keeping a very close eye on white nationalism, which may help me understand how law enforcement has been handling, or in this case, not handling, domestic counterterrorism. While reading the paragraph, I learned that this officer from Florida discovered that the state police, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and local politicians, including the governor, had no helpful information on the alt-right. So, in the section where I will record my notes, I'm going to write that, and note that this was just last year. Good. Now let's keep reading. One of those coming to Gainesville was William Fears, a 31-year-old from Houston. Based on that first sentence, I think it's safe to assume that this paragraph is just more details about what Lieutenant Stout discovered about William Fears, who was planning a speech at the University of Florida. Based on the first sentence of the next paragraph that ends with the words, was on edge. This paragraph may include some details as to what preparations the city made because of this feeling of uneasiness. Skimming through the paragraph, the words, law enforcement sent out caught my eye. After reading that entire sentence from the beginning, I read that just prior to Richard Spencer's speech in Florida, law enforcement in Florida published a book of information detailing around 20 prominent people who are openly associated with Spencer, or who are associated with groups that oppose what Richard Spencer represents. I read on, and I learned that looking at anonymous online comments on sites like 4chan revealed that some of the people planning to attend Spencer's speech would be bringing guns. That's definitely going in my notes. I was curious. After the article identified the website 4chan as a place where law enforcement learned more about who was coming to the speech, I have a new question. What is 4chan? I'm going to add that to the new question section, but wait to research that because I don't think that learning more about 4chan is necessary to understanding this article. Looking at the first sentences of the next 7 paragraphs, they contain more information about the events that unfolded around the time of the speech. That may answer other questions I have, or will have, but I'm focused on how law enforcement's domestic counterterrorism strategies have changed in the past 20 years. I'm going to move on. It's interesting that, in the next paragraph, white supremacists and is in bold. This makes me think that the article is going to sort of zoom out on this recent event, and address domestic terrorism more in general. I'm going to read this paragraph. Okay, after reading that paragraph, I realized that it shares statistics, with links to specific reports, that show how far-right extremists are responsible for more deaths than other extremist groups. That's definitely going to be helpful in answering some of my other questions. I'll make a mental note to return to this article for those questions. Next paragraph. I'm so glad I read that next paragraph. I learned that over the past 20 or so years, the United States counterterrorism strategy has focused almost exclusively on Islamic extremists, or jihadists, and essentially not considering right-wing extremists as a threat to national security. Reading the next paragraph, I read that during President Trump's first year in office, senior administration officials met to discuss counterterrorism strategies that would include a wider range of threats, like right-wing extremists. It goes on to say that the government, in the past, often purposefully looked the other way on white extremists because addressing it could negatively impact a politician's political career. The next paragraph looks like it's going to provide the details surrounding another example of domestic terrorism. I'm gonna keep going. The first sentence of the next paragraph is, in this atmosphere of apparent indifference on the part of government officials and law enforcement, a virulent and violent far-right movement has grown and metastasized. That's basically saying, since the government hasn't really concerned itself with right-wing extremists, that movement has been able to grow and spread. It then says, to combat it, so I can safely assume it's going to discuss what has been proposed for the future. My question is about the past, so I'm moving on. There was relevant and significant information in that paragraph. It said that the majorities of agencies that report hate crimes to the FBI reported that there were no hate crimes in 2016. This seems to be further proof that right-wing extremism isn't being looked at closely. The next 10 or so paragraphs, after reading each paragraph's first sentence, don't seem as though they'll offer more information I can use to answer my question. However, I stopped at the paragraph that begins with, in April 2009, for obvious reasons. That's almost 10 years ago, which is right smack in the middle of the time period I'm interested in. After reading that paragraph, I discovered that the Department of Homeland Security issued a report that warned of an increase in right-wing extremism. That's good to know. The next 5 paragraphs don't seem as though they'll offer information I'm looking for. However, reading the first sentence of the next paragraph, it said, years of law enforcement investigation and infiltration of right-wing terror groups commenced, and by the early 1990s. That made me go back to the previous paragraph because it said, commenced. That implies that something happened that led to the law enforcement investigation. I'm going to read both paragraphs. So here's what I learned. In the 1980s, far-right separatists, in other words, people who believed that separating different ethnicities, religions, or genders would be a good thing, started to collect food and weapons, and began training in preparation for what they believed would soon be the end of the world. Also, racist extremists began bombing, robbing, and murdering, which came to a head when a Jewish radio host who often spoke out against anti-Semitism in Denver was killed. I'm going to keep reading. As it turns out, law enforcement investigation and infiltration of right-wing terror groups commenced, and by the early 1990s, many of the movement's most violent members were dead or in jail. I'll leave that as a direct quote because I think if I attempt to paraphrase that, I may lose its authority and precision. That's a good reason to leave it as a direct quote. Plus, the rest of my notes, so far, have been paraphrases of the article. After finishing that paragraph and the next, here's what I learned. After the infamous Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, which killed 168 people, the FBI added more agents to focus on domestic terrorism. The Attorney General even initiated the investigation of domestic terrorism by a special task force. However, by the end of 2001, because of the events of 9/11, nearly all law enforcement attention turned toward international terrorism. Okay, I've really gotten a substantial amount of information that answers my original question. Although I'm only about halfway through this article, it's time to take a break. So, there you have it. This should now serve as an excellent example of how to gather detailed information in response to an initial research question. It may help to keep this video handy, and refer back to it. Not only does it demonstrate how to take substantial notes from a trustworthy source, it also offers strategies for how to tackle a source with an overwhelming amount of information. What to do when your source includes terms that are new to you, but are really important to understand in order to make sense of the article. When and why to directly quote text, and when to pause momentarily to jot down a new question to research at a later time. This is Ned Schneebly signing off. I will see you cats on the flip-flop later.